Good evening, everybody.
Hi guys.
Today,
Hi.
Jay and I are back with another episode on the ongoing and soon to conclude elections in Jammu and Kashmir. There's quite a lot to discuss, so we thought it would be wise to release an episode on this matter. As we know, this is the first legislative assembly election in the former erstwhile state, now union territory of J&K, and the last one was in I think 2014 with the election of the then BJP PDP government, which lasted about 2-3 years in its proper form. In 2018, it was dismissed and a governor's rule was set up, and that stayed on till the revocation of Article 370. And the events that followed have, to quite an extent, complicated the situation in the Kashmir Valley. And now we know the JNK is more than the Kashmir Valley. There is the hill areas of the Jammu region. There are votes of the Gujar Bakarwal communities that are important. So I think it would be important that Jay and I have a well thought out, fairly deep discussion on this matter. So Jay, let's get your opening thoughts.
So 1987 is the year which is considered to be the preceding incident before the militancy actually hit the valley, because before 1987 the valley was always tense, but there was never this sense of separatism in the valley. And obviously Kashmiris from the time of from the pre-Islamic times has been carrying forward its unique identity within the Indian civilization. So a lot of arguments that I hear stating that Kashmir was never really part of the wider Indic civilization are also kind of flawed in my opinion. But on top of that, I feel Kashmir was one of the very few places where Central Asia and India actually came together. It was a very, very unique mix, and it is said that it is so genetically diverse that you can actually trace the earliest forms of Aryan migration in the genetics of Kashmiris. So yeah, given the diversity of the place, with it also came a lot of political instability historically, because this area was always changing hands. It also came under the sweeps of the Mongols. Then later on, once the influence of Hindus and Buddhist kings started declining, Islam basically took the threshold, and eventually a very syncretic culture formed in JNK, which manifested itself mostly in Sufism. And then we finally bring ourselves to the post 1979 era. With respect to Islamic politics, I feel 1979 is a very important year. You had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which basically uh, snowballed the entire Muslim world into finally talking about quote unquote the battle for the Ummah, or the greater Muslim family. Then there was the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which was also a very, very important incident. Then the third, there are four instances. My bad. The third incident has to be the siege of uh, of uh, of Makkah, where the Masjid al Haram was taken over by militants. And this really put the Al Saud family in Saudi Arabia in a very, very precarious situation, because their authority over the Muslim world was suddenly being challenged. And the fourth one has to be the Muslim Brotherhood rebellion in Syria. So these four instances basically curated where Islamic politics of the world would lead in the coming years. And of course, given the vociferous nature of these political movements, there had to be ripples in the subcontinent as well, given the fact that the Pakistanis played a key role in supporting the jihad against the Soviets. And naturally, once the Soviets left, the whole mantle was shifted towards Kashmir. It said that in mid 80s, late 80s, the feeling of separatism from India was only and only rising. And the idea of the fraternal instincts with the Afghans, with the Palestinians, was also being implemented. And to top that, in 1987, when these tensions were already there, the election was rigged in favor of Farooq Abdullah, who was the son of Sheikh Abdullah. Sheikh Abdullah was a very close confidant of Nehru, and he also played a key role in the Treaty of Accession. And he was made the prime minister of of the state of Jammu and Kashmir within the Indian Union. Now, this 87 election is very, very crucial because this basically forced a certain section of the political class of JNK into thinking that the Indian Union is just a cauldron of broken promises and their political aspirations can never be met with. So they decided to pick up the Kalashnikov, and you had the creation of JKLF. And later on, with the influence of Pakistan, with the Soviets leaving, more hardcore fundamentalist Islamic elements were
A lot of
also
militants
foreign
also
militants
started
were
coming in.
introduced, and the early 90s till early 2000s was the worst phase in JNK, where you had killings, encounters, bomb blasts, attacks
Yeah,
almost
I
every day.
think mid
Yeah,
80s in the political
yeah,
narrative, the voice of separatism had started coming in, but it was nowhere as
yeah.
near as extreme as the violent form that it took post the
1987
1987
election,
election rigging.
allegedly.
And in fact, in the Smita Prakash podcast very recently, Sajjad Lone appeared, where he also said that, what would have been worse if you had lost the election or the consequence the valley had to face, or if after the quote unquote rigging of the election, because at least in the people of the valley's view, the election was totally rigged. The government lacked legitimacy. Farooq Abdullah ended up resigning, and the governor's rule was set up. We know what happened in J&K, Kashmir Valley after the 1990s. 1991, 1990 is also the time when the Kashmiri Pandit exodus happened. And post that, the security forces of India saw what can easily be considered the worst phase
Worst
of
phase
the
of the
Kashmir
Kashmir insurgency.
insurgency. Now, prior to all of this, and even till recent history, National Conference and PDP have been the two dominant parties there. Basically, National Conference being the Abdullah family and PDP being the Muftis, which is added fuel to the narrative that mainstream parties like the BJP in Delhi have always alleged that this is a sort of dynasty politics going on in the Kashmir Valley. परिवारवाद का आरोप जो लगाया जाता है. So there is an element of discord maybe on the people of the valley also, against a sort of quote unquote family rule. Uh, One thing that I want to add to the conversation we were having about the 1987 elections rigging was that Sheikh Abdullah's son Farooq Abdullah, when he sort of allegedly quote unquote got the election rigged or whatever, many mainstream separatist leaders lost confidence in the electoral system in itself, which led to the creation of the Hurriyat, which possibly drove many separatist Hurriyat leaders to flirt with the ISI, and that drove maybe many people into the insurgent path. I'm not fully blaming the Abdullahs or the election rigging process, because we have too little information to make anything conclusive on this. I'm just saying that this was the perspective highlighted by Sajjad Lone on the episode with Smita Prakash. So maybe that is also one view that we can consider, that after the election rigging, many leaders got very disenfranchised with the Indian political system, and that's why they got drawn to separatism. In fact, I took Sajjad Lone's name because Sajjad Lone, with respect to Kashmir politics, is a very interesting figure. He is the son of a separatist, A.G. Lone, the founder of JKPC, Jammu Kashmir People's Conference. His father in law was a separatist leader. His wife is actually a Pakistani passport holder. Despite all these potentials to draw wedges, his the prime allegation that he faces is that he is alleged to be a stooge of the BJP of the state that is in Delhi. So it's a very interesting dynamic that takes place over there. So that's he's also going to be an interesting actor in these assembly elections. There are forecasts that indicate that his JKPC will win some seats. There is another element here that many independent candidates are coming up. Many of them come from the Jamaati background. another one of whom came on the Smita Prakash podcast, also interestingly brought up the 1987 elections. So the 1987 elections are actually playing a
Key
role
role.
even in the 2024 elections,
Yeah.
where he also spoke about why the people involved should have evaluated its consequences. So today, as we speak, there are many new parties, JKPC and JKAP, Jammu Kashmir Apni Party.
Mhm.
Even some independent candidates are seen to be favoring the establishment in Delhi. Many are seen to be siphoning off votes from the Jammu Kashmir PDP, the National Conference, and all of that. So these dynamics are very interesting, and these are the dynamics which are shaping up the 2024 Legislative Assembly elections in Kashmir.
You
Jai.
know, Kashmir historically is so important for the Indian civilization because one of the most important recorded recorded histories uh, about early medieval India and early medieval India is from Kashmir called the Raj Tarangini, which was written by Kalhan. So from that angle, Kashmir has always been very, very important in understanding the geopolitical nature of India historically. And 1987 is a very, very crucial time, is because even though we can say that there could have been a rigging, but what is the evidence pointing towards the fact that even without the rigging there wouldn't have been any political conflict? That is the number one question.
That's a valid
Number
point.
two question that I'm trying to put your concentration towards is that late 1980s was also a time when there were a lot of movements within the Indian state which were catching a lot of traction. The Shah Bano case, where which basically talked about the Uniform Civil Code, and which led to the resignation of this famous Congress leader who's now in the BJP and is the Kerala governor, if I'm not wrong. What's his name?
Arif Mohammed.
Arif Mohammed. And to counter the Shah Bano case, the Rajiv Gandhi government also started giving fans to the fire around the whole Babri Masjid issue. And mind you, this is the 80s. Now, talking
I
about.
think Rajiv
Mhm.
Gandhi was the one who allowed for
Yeah,
the lock at the Babri
Babri Masjid.
Masjid to be destroyed and
Yeah,
idol of
broken and
Ram Lala to be
to be
placed.
placed. So this was a very controversial move from the perspective of Kashmiris. Now you have to understand, JNK is the only Muslim dominated state of the country around that time. And if you include Union Territory, there's Maldives as well. Sorry, there's Lakshadweep as well, but that's irrelevant. So people in JNK start feeling that, okay, so here you're talking about, raising a mosque in favor of your religion. So automatically people in the 80s start thinking that this government, the Indian Union, is actually not the Indian Union, it's the Hindu Union. And because we are Muslims is automatically against us. Now taking you back to the late 70s, like 1979 being the very, very important year for Islamic politics in general. Of course, you had the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan. You also had the Islamic Revolution in Iran, right? So these two instances also had a very, very profound impact on Kashmiri Kashmiri politics, and that's when they realized that, okay, Hindu Union, revolution in Iran, which who are like culturally very similar, and the fact that the whole global pulse is in your favor, and you have a neighbor which is willing to fund your fantasies.
To add to that, you're making a very interesting
Hmm.
point, and I would be also myself, I would be careful before blaming the entire militancy and insurgency campaign in the Kashmir Valley on the 1987 elections,
Exactly.
mainly because of three factors. A, we already knew that there was a voice of separatism that was being raised,
Hmm.
and there were alarmist factions that were coming up from even the early 80s.
Even the 70s, you had a plane hijacking by Kashmiri
Yeah.
separatists.
So
Hmm.
now that brings us to 1980s India's, where we are already now grappling with the ISI, which is working overtime to fuel secessionist movements in India. We also had worsening of the Punjab situation in the
Hmm.
1980s. So what evidence is there when you have a proximate geographical entity like the JNK, where people already many people in the Kashmir Valley, the ISI knew, don't that strongly identify with the Indian Union.
Mhm.
So what evidence is there that the ISI wouldn't have started sending in weapons and
Of course.
armored ammunition and weapons, etc., to wage war against the Indian
Absolutely.
state, even without the rigging of the elections.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not defending Farooq Abdullah here, but I think we need to be more evidence based in our critique of the 1987 election alone, because I think that it can be a slightly intellectually lazy. It was definitely a factor that accelerated the worsening of the situation in the Kashmir Valley,
Mhm.
but the writing was on the wall. It was going to have a scare of militancy and terrorism regardless, and to what degree that could have gone, it's really difficult to estimate in today's day.
Yeah.
So to blame one assembly election for it is also
Absolutely. So in 80s or
not
something,
fair.
in 90s, sorry, what had happened was that suddenly the Soviets had gone, and there was this entire generation of trained militants who had no other purpose. So they were being directed to these other quote
also a fair
unquote
point.
global jihads. You had like the war in Bosnia Herzegovina, which is a very, very interesting example because for the Bosnian Mujahideen, you had Afghans and Arabs, all of them were fighting. Some of them even tried to get Bosnian citizenship, and the same thing was being done in Kashmir as well, where you had like these foreign militants trying to enter India's territory, and it was very, very violent. It was grotesque.
This is
Yeah.
on the more hypothesis side,
Yeah.
or more of a, maybe like some people might call this conspiracy, but there is sufficient evidence to state that there was an overwhelming presence of foreign
No,
militants
there is
from
enough evidence. There is enough evidence.
many Muslim countries,
Yeah.
not just Kashmiri locals, or many times people would say
Pathans.
Pakistani army would send in Pathans,
Yeah.
or sometimes Pakistani army would send in its own personnel. Where in 1989 you have the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, so now there are thousands of trained mujahideen without a job,
Yeah.
and the accessibility from maybe the Hindu Kush mountains into maybe the Karakoram region,
Mhm.
with the support of the Pakistani state, is not that difficult, can easily be done in a year or two.
Yeah.
So an realignment of militants from perhaps Afghanistan
Mhm.
to the Kashmir Valley was done maybe from this period of 1989 to the early 90s, which was like this adjustment period for these militants to sort of settle themselves in the Kashmir Valley, or the Trans Himalayas, to sort of position themselves into India
Yeah,
and wage war.
that is the genesis of organizations like Al Farhan. Al Farhan was an organization which famously kidnapped tourists from Europe, and some of them disappeared and they never really saw the day of light. It is said that they got killed in a failed rescue operation between the Indian army and the militants, and it is said that they were buried in the countless unmarked graves that were there in the valley. Unfortunate, but yeah, that is the sad reality. Now you have to understand another aspect is that in 90s there was now a camp that was being created. There was a moderate camp and then there was an extremist camp even within the separatist movement. The moderate camp was more towards getting an independent JNK. Then the extremist camp was more towards a union with Pakistan, and the extremist camp is basically the genesis of organizations like Al Farhan. You had Harkatul Mujahideen. Then you had the creation of LET, Lashkar-e-Toiba, and these are the few organizations which were quite active in and around JNK around that time, and people like Mr. Sajjad Lone's own father, who was also the head of All Party Hurriyat.
Yeah, he used to head the Hurriyat.
All Party Hurriyat
Yeah,
committee or
yeah.
commission.
He used to.
Yeah.
He played a key role in
Yeah,
forming
so
the Hurriyat.
he was one of the moderate leaders, and he was also assassinated by these quote unquote extremist elements.
Yeah, and Sajjad Lone at the time openly came out and blamed the ISI for his father's death.
Yeah.
Farooq Abdullah did the same for the death of AG Lone.
Yeah.
AG Lone was a separatist leader, so naturally there is a tension with the Indian state, but in the valley he is a fairly well respected figure. And as you can see now that Sajjad Lone has taken a more moderate stand, he has integrated himself with the Indian state. He speaks of obviously speaks of the restoration of Article 370, as most Kashmiri politicians do, even the ones who are seen perceived to be close to the BJP. And he speaks of many other interesting things like economic decentralization, and he's got many economics related ideas, which is, it's always interesting to see a Kashmiri politician sort of go outside the prescribed things that, you speak about separatism, you speak about India, Pakistan, but you don't go outside of that gambit. He's a trained chartered accountant. He's lived in London for a while, so he's a suave, urbane. So anyway, Sajad Loan is now perceived to be closer to the BJP, as is Engineer Rashid, interestingly, who's ideologically much close to the Jamaat factions. Interestingly, however, maybe allegedly siphoning off BJP votes, as I said earlier. Uh, PDP was seen to be the most extreme mainstream party, because PDP in its manifesto always said that it wants to go back to the pre-1952 agreement between the Kashmir, the state of Jammu and Kashmir in India, which implied the existence of a separate prime minister of Jammu and Kashmir, yet obviously having external affairs defense with India still, but the degree of autonomy on PDP's manifesto demanded was a lot more than maybe that of the National Conference. So I think what the revocation of Article 370 did, very interestingly, that even the more radical sort of parties have now gotten away from going from a pre 1952 status to pre 2019 status. So now nobody is speaking of setting up of a prime minister, or at the very least they are not speaking about it very openly. It may be mentioned on a manifesto here or there, but a all out secession from Indian state is not something that people are saying very openly anymore. So they have all gone back to the restoration of statehood, restoration of Article 370, that even the parties which are aligned with the BJP or allegedly aligned with the BJP are doing. So that's a very interesting sort of complex dynamic that has come up, that almost everybody is saying that they want to go back to the pre 2019 status. Nobody is now speaking of having that Sadre Riyasat or Wazir Azam or whatever you call the president and a prime minister of the Kashmir, erstwhile JNK.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of dynamics to catch up here.
Yeah. There is also the issue of resettling the Kashmiri Pandits in some of their older neighborhoods. But what happens is that a lot of things are left in politics and promises. Politics and promises are two things which never go hand in hand. Because if you're in politics, there would be some promises that would be made, but there would be some promises that would be, set aside. And after a while, you cannot, give in to everyone's wishes. And unfortunately, that is the sad reality for Kashmiri Pandits, because still there are a lot of people, thousands of people who are living in camps both in Jammu and in New Delhi. And it seems like most of the conversation around the resettling of the Kashmiri Pandits, specifically that is being driven by the Sangh and the BJP, is only for political rhetoric. It's not, seeing the day of light. And unfortunately, it's gonna be like that for the coming future, from what I can analyze. Because even if a normal Kashmiri Pandit returns to JNK, there have been instances even in the past few years where either they've been killed or they've been forced to leave because of the pressure and the fear that is being created by the Pakistani funded Islamist militants.
Yeah, I was going to Kashmir a few years back, actually not few years back, 2023 October. So about exactly a year before we are recording this. And there was a gentleman who I knew who used to work in the CRPF, and I was just out of curiosity inquiring with him about the security situation there. And naturally, and anybody you speak to in the security forces will give you the same opinion, that as long as you don't belong to the security forces or or from the Kashmiri Pandit groups, you are safe. So if you're in the Kashmir Valley and there is a threat to your life, you are either an instrument of the state in the form of the CRPF, the Indian Army, the JK police. Then your life is at threat, or you are a Kashmiri Pandit that is being resettled. Tourists are naturally a source of revenue generation for a lot of businesses in the valley. Many of them have relations with people in the Hurriyat and all of that also. So I think there is no like resentment of Kashmiris towards like the average Indian, especially if you're just coming to like visit or whatever. But as long as you plan to leave or you're not trying to resettle anybody there. But the ideas of resettlement, from what I understand, can get these sort of insurgent organizations very riled up.
Yeah.
So my assessment is that resettlement of Kashmiri Pandits is not going to be an easy task.
It's not going to be
Even
easy.
the sort of extremer political parties like the PDP and even NC is not extreme, but for the scope of this conversation, NC, they have all said that their agenda involves some level of resettlement of Kashmiri Pandits. And again, Sajjad Lone on his interview said that he would give his right arm for it. Whether it's honest or a rhetorical statement, that is for a different debate.
Yeah.
But whoever tries to do it, whether it's the union government or the state government after it comes to power, whether it's the IB, resettlement of Kashmiri Pandits in JNK, especially the valleys, it's not going to be easy. There will be militancy related incidences. There will be Pakistan who will try to conduct some attacks on these efforts. As we speak today, also, I think there was an encounter in Kathua.
Yeah.
So that's Jammu, but it's not like the situation has.
Yeah, a lot of
totally
Hindus from the
normalized.
hill areas of Jammu are also forced to retreat or start their little defense units because of the threats that they face for following their religion. But that is a common practice. That has been the common practice of the Islamist militants for a very long time. It is absolutely nothing new. But what it does is that in the mainstream Indian politics, it is somehow used to justify the violence that Muslims have to face in North India, specifically by the Hindu extremists. So yeah, don't do that. Don't do that, because these two things are totally separate. And if you use one particular incident to justify violence in, say, some other part of the country, it is just like you're operating like the Third Reich, like the Nazi party. So I would suggest that people bring in more nuance in their approach towards understanding the issue of Kashmir and of JNK. There is also one thing that Kashmiris talk about a lot, and again, I hate going to history, but this is where you need to understand that even certain Kashmiri players are wrong in justifying the exodus of Kashmiri Pandits. They say that during the Dogra Raj, that is the rule of the Dogra kings over the valley, the Pandits used to be the elite class. They used to run the government institutions. They were the lawyers and the bankers, and the Dogras, being Rajputs, were the Kshatriyas. So in that phase, they faced a lot of oppression and suffering, and that is what eventually led to this strong resentment against the Kashmiri Pandits, and that is why they picked up arms against them and told them to get out.
Yeah,
But doesn't that justify a lot of things that the right-wing Hindus also have to say about
there's
the
also, yeah, I mean,
Islamic expansionism in India? So it's a very, very slippery slope. I would suggest that no one on both the sides, jump to certain conclusions like this.
there's a god awful Barkhadat clip
Yeah,
from the Kashmir Valley,
exactly.
and it's quite old. It must be a couple of decades old
Yeah.
at least, where she's sort of giving a economic overview of the day-to-day activities that the Kashmiri Pandits were engaged in, and it almost seems like a very thinly veiled justification of the exodus,
Yeah.
that the Kashmiri Pandits were sort of privileged and sort of
Just because a community is
well-to-do,
privileged, that doesn't mean
and
they're forced to leave their place.
and look
That's
at the disproportionality in
Yeah.
the response. You're
Absolutely.
almost coming on national television and justifying a migration, quote unquote migration, or exodus, rather massacre
Mhm.
of almost like thousands of people. And to justify that on national media, it's honestly shameful. I've honestly thought that Indian media can do better
Yeah,
than
and
that.
that's the thing. But when once you see a right-wing Hindutva troll saying the same thing, you guys are absolutely petrified. But the same conversation, when it happens from certain other political ideologues, you just you just look over it. So
Yeah, I
my
mean,
humble
and
request.
we are trying to be as unbiased
Yeah,
as we can here,
yeah,
because we are not like
yeah.
trying to endorse any ideology.
Exactly. So my humble request from both the sides, all the sides here, is to understand the nuance. Don't try to justify violence against minority groups just because of their societal standards. Because in some cases, minority groups either they leave or they pick up arms. Or they pick up arms against the state, and they believe that the state cannot protect them at all, as we saw what happened in Bihar. Unrelated.
Anyway, we're coming back to Jammu and Kashmir. These elections are quite interesting to me also because people aren't really ruling out any kind of post-poll alliances. We earlier had a statement by Omar Abdullah where he said that he won't become chief minister as long as JNK is a UT, but he's sort of retracted on that. I also think that whether it's JKPC, whether it's PDP, whether it's the new independent sort of Jamaat candidates, none of them are ruling out any kind of post-poll alliances. So who forms the government, how radically opposed they are to each other, we'll have to see. And we haven't spoken of the BJP because BJP is considered a party that doesn't really belong to the valley. But now we need to remember that JNK is not the valley. We also have the J side of it. Jammu is
The Hindu side of it.
an area where BJP will play a critical role. Now, after the 2022 delimitation, which also we haven't spoken about in this episode, the 2022 delimitation saw creation of 6 additional seats in the Jammu region and 1 additional seat in the Kashmir Valley. So these 6 seats might sort of weigh in more power in the election result, and even BJP might end up playing a critical role in who forms the government. So don't be surprised whether if you see hypothetically a BJP coalition with Jamaat independent candidates running the JNK government, which would be very strange ideologically, but it's a possibility. If we saw BJP and PDP run a government together, even this remains a possibility. So there are going to be many factions, and who controls how many seats in the assembly, who forms the government is something that we are all eager to watch. On that note, I think October 8th is going to be a very interesting day. And
7th October is also 1-year anniversary of the Hamas attack, so it's going to be a very interesting day.
Yeah, so I think those are my concluding
Yeah,
statements.
those are my concluding statements as well. Please be very careful before making assumptions. Always be empathetic towards everyone who suffered violence, be it Hindu, Muslim, Christian, or caste violence. It's very important that we show empathy to the side which has suffered the most, or the side which is not in power and is it's being discriminated against. So please try to walk in that other person's shoe and try to understand their plight before coming to generalizations and spreading hatred. And yeah, thank you.
And thank you for tuning in.
Thank you for tuning in. Love you
Like,
guys.
share, subscribe.
Yeah. Shaba khair.
Uh,
And keep the Sufism alive in JNK. Yeah.
बंद हो चुका है भाई, काट देंगे